hold him as either a libertarian or a left Occupy kind of guy because he had elements of both, and this is Tom Paine. Tom Paine. So a couple of minutes on Tom Paine. If you don't know anything about him, he was somebody who was very different from the other American founding fathers, very different, because he was not part of the elite. I mean, most of these famous founding fathers that all these books are published about now today, they're part of the American elite. George Washington was the richest man in America, mostly through land ownings. A lot of the other folks, wealthy plantation owners with lots of slaves, people like Thomas Jefferson. In the North, up here, you have people like John Adams, part of the elite, the financial, legal elite, political elite. Tom Paine is really different. Tom Paine, as late as 1774, he's still in England, he's floundering, he's an artisan, he's having a hard way to go, and he decides, well, he's going to go to America in 1774, so just a couple of years before the Revolution. He goes. He gets a letter of introduction from Ben Franklin, lands in Philadelphia, and he becomes intoxicated by American anti-authoritarianism, and just intoxicated by it. And being more connected to the regular folks, he realizes that the American anti-authoritarianism is much closer to what, you know, much closer to where it's much further along than a lot of the elite. Okay, so for him, he realizes, you know, here's George Washington, who's still toasting King George as late as 1775. And most of these folks are just railing against Parliament's taxation without representation. But Paine goes, to heck with the whole of British authority, not just Parliament, to heck with King George, to heck with the British East India Corporation, to heck with all. And he utters the taboo word at the time, independence. It was taboo, even among these founding fathers. And he's a secessionist, really. Tom Paine is one of the great revolutionaries in American and world history, but he's also a secessionist. And so he puts out this thing called Common Sense in January 1776, and by the end of the Revolution, 500,000 people read it, and which would be the equivalent of over 50 million people today, and he sparks a revolution, all right? Now, Tom Paine, if you understand who he is, he's definitely, you know, you would have a hard time labeling him as either a libertarian or a left Occupy person. He certainly believed in private property. He certainly was an entrepreneur. He was always tinkering with these bridge ideas, iron bridge ideas, smokeless candles. Okay, he really wasn't crazy about government. Libertarians always invoke his famous statement about government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. But what libertarians sometimes forget was he also wrote a pamphlet called Agrarian Justice in the 1790s. And in that pamphlet, he goes beyond Social Security in some ways. He decides that, like, look, people have lost their natural inheritance because of the system of landed property, and it's up to the wealthy elite to kick in some money, not only for people who are disabled, but also for folks when they turn 21, okay? Because he believed that if you're going to have any kind of real democracy, which he was passionate anti-authoritarian, passionately believed in democracy, you couldn't have a lot of people, a certain amount of people with a lot of money and nobody else with any. So he had elements of both, all right? And I think this is real important for folks to remember here, that a lot of what the divides to nowadays into separate camps have been created by the media, by mainstream corporate media to kind of divide and conquer people, all right? There's a lot of connections throughout American history between, of anti-authoritarians and populists. All right, so some of the ways I think that we can really advance these coalitions, these alliances, is just a little bit about how we talk about the ruling elite, what they're really all about, what names we use for them, all right? And so one of the things that I found that just for the mainstream corporate media, just the idea to talk about that we don't have a democracy here, we just do have a kind of tyranny in America, that seems for them crazy. That seems nuts, okay? But, you know, the reality is, you know, I mean, for them, the only kind of tyrannies exist in places like the Middle East or in Africa where you have some sort of a dictator, you know, somebody in a military uniform, you know, shooting a rifle in the sky, not caring where the bullets come down, that kind of thing, you know. But the reality is, most American people believe that we don't really live in a democracy. They know, I talk about it, Get Up, Stand Up, they go through the polls. Most Americans have been opposed to these endless, senseless wars. Most Americans were opposed to these insurance company big bank bailouts. Most Americans are opposed to a lot of these issues that still happen, but they realize that they feel like they have no power, which means they're saying they don't live in a democracy. They're living in some sort of tyranny. So what do we call this tyranny that would help unify anti-authoritarians? Well, the term that I used is corporatocracy, which a corporatocracy means that it's a combination of these giant, too-big-to-fail corporations, these large banks, large insurance companies, now we know too-big-to-jail CEOs, along with these, some of these mega billionaires who made their money through corporate welfare, corporate cronyism, who hand out their money, hand out a few million here and there to these politicians, Democrats and Republicans, okay, in government, in federal government, in state government. So it's a combination of those things. And I've noticed in 2011, again, the mainstream media, corporate media did not report this, but actually there was dialogue, a lot of dialogue, in-person dialogue between Ralph Nader and Ron Paul talking about this issue, using words like corporatist. I mean, they used word like corporatist similarly to the way people during the American Revolution talked about the Tories. And they viewed them, both of themselves, as anti-corporatists, both Ron Paul and Ralph Nader, on those issues that I already talked about, anti-war, anti-corporate welfare. They also were talked about NAFTA, the Patriot Act, lots of issues they went through. They also made it clear that they didn't agree on everything. And they weren't talking about forming any kind of political party, but they believed that there was lots of things that they agreed on. So my personal experience using this word corporatocracy and corporatist is that it really unifies folks. I'll tell you a story. I did this libertarian radio show a few years back. It was out in New Orleans with a guy, the show was called Baldy and the Blonde. Baldy and the Blonde. And I talked to Baldy, Tom, and we were going through this whole idea of corporatocracy, and he was real interested in it. He said, that makes perfect sense to me. What's the difference between the kind of left view and the kind of libertarian view of corporatocracy? And I said, well, you hear a lot of libertarians rail against big government. And a lot of folks on the left talk about these giant corporations with the idea that, those who have the most money, the giant corporations, the people with the most money are really the senior partners in this corporatocracy, and the politicians are really the lackeys, more like what George Carlin said. And this guy, Tom, who was a self-identified libertarian, he started to laugh. He says, well, Bruce, you might have convinced me just on this issue not to be a libertarian anymore, to be a left-Occupy person, because this seemed to make sense to him, and he started to laugh. And I thought that's also an important thing. The reason why I liked Tom, that was because I convinced him to be something different, but because he was willing to not be afraid of what his audience thought was politically correct or not politically correct, willing to care more about the issues, willing to care more about a dialogue than what was pleasing to his particular camp and his audience. And that's really important if we really want to form alliances among anti-authoritarians. Another real important area, I think, that will really help folks is to move these kinds of alliances, coalitions, and convergences along, is to really have more confidence, a lot more confidence, that although people here are more active than the rest of the American people who've been in lots of ways pacified, that really they represent what I'm talking about, what we're talking about here at this festival, really represents what the majority of American people feel. So I'll give you an example of this, and I talk about Get Up, Stand Up, and I updated a poll, I updated an article more recently. There was a Rasmussen's Report poll a few years ago on populism. And they discovered that 65% of Americans were populists, 80% if you include leaners. Well, how'd they do that? Well, let me give you a couple of questions and give you the percentage breakdown. On one question, they asked, do you trust the judgment of the American people on important issues that face our society, or do you trust the judgment of the American political leaders? And 76% trusted the American people, did not trust the political leaders. That's populism. They also asked people,